Karla Faye Tucker. There are crimes so brutal that they seem to sever the perpetrator from humanity itself, leaving us to wonder if the person who committed them could ever truly return. When that person then claims to have found God, to have been reborn into something entirely different, we face a question that tears at the very fabric of justice and mercy. These aren't abstract philosophical musings. They're the questions that haunted the final years of Karla Faye Tucker's life and divided a nation as her execution date approached. Because this wasn't just another murder case. This was about whether we believe people can truly change, or whether some acts place you forever beyond forgiveness. This was about a woman who became a born-again Christian on death row, whose supporters included the Pope himself, and whose tearful pleas for mercy were broadcast into living rooms across America. But underneath all that transformation, underneath the Bible verses and the prayers, was the undeniable reality of what happened on a June night in 1983. 23-year-old Karla Faye Tucker was already living in a kind of hell before she created one of her own making. Born and raised in Houston, she'd been smoking cigarettes by age 8, using hard drugs by 11, and working as a prostitute by 12. Her mother, a rock band groupie, had dragged her along on tours, introducing her daughter to a world of sex and substances before she'd even reached adolescence. By the time she met Daniel Garrett, a man 14 years her senior, Tucker was deeply entrenched in the drug underworld. Their relationship was built on a foundation of shared addiction and reckless behavior. Together, they would cross a line that neither could ever uncross. In the early morning hours of June 13, 1983, after days of continuous drug use involving heroin, speed, alcohol, and virtually every substance they could consume, Tucker and Garrett decided to break into the apartment of Jerry Lynn Dean. Tucker knew Dean through his estranged wife, and she'd been nursing a grudge against him. Their stated intention was to steal motorcycle parts and intimidate him. But what transpired in that apartment transformed a burglary into something far darker. When they found Dean in his bedroom, Garrett began striking him with a hammer. Tucker, rather than stopping him, picked up a 15-pound pickaxe. Dean begged for his life as she raised it above her head. She struck him 28 times. Years later, in statements that would haunt the public consciousness, Tucker admitted that with each strike of the pickaxe, she'd experienced sexual gratification. But the nightmare wasn't finished. Hidden beneath the bedsheets was 32-year-old Deborah Ruth Thornton, a woman who'd simply had the misfortune of spending the night with Dean after meeting him at a party hours earlier. When Tucker discovered her presence, there was a moment where a choice could still have been made. Instead, Tucker attacked Thornton with the same pickaxe, striking her repeatedly before leaving the weapon embedded in her chest. When authorities arrived at the scene the following morning, they found both bodies in a pool of blood, the pickaxe still lodged in Thornton's torso like a marker of unimaginable violence. The investigation moved swiftly. Within weeks, Tucker and Garrett were arrested. What sealed their fate wasn't just the physical evidence, but Tucker's own words. Police wiretaps captured her bragging about the murders, laughing as she recounted the details, describing her experience in terms so disturbing that prosecutors knew they had a case that demanded the harshest penalty Texas law could provide. During her trial in 1984, Tucker initially pleaded not guilty on the advice of her attorneys, though she later expressed regret about that decision. The jury, comprised of 8 women and 4 men, heard testimony that left no doubt about her involvement. Both Tucker and Garrett received the death penalty. Then, something unexpected began to happen. Shortly after her incarceration, Tucker picked up a Bible from the prison ministry program. She later described reading it in her cell, not fully understanding what she was absorbing, until she found herself on her knees in the middle of the floor, asking for forgiveness. In October of 1983, just months after the murders, she converted to Christianity. Over the following 14 years, Tucker became a model prisoner. She married a prison minister by proxy in 1995 and dedicated herself to ministry work behind bars. Prison officials testified to her transformation. Her case attracted attention from figures as diverse as Pope John Paul II, televangelist Pat Robertson, and even Ronald Carlson, the brother of victim Deborah Thornton, who'd undergone his own religious conversion and come to oppose her execution. The question of whether to spare Tucker's life became a national debate that transcended typical partisan divisions. Here was a woman who'd committed an act of staggering violence, yet appeared to have genuinely changed. Did that transformation matter? Should it matter? Governor George W. Bush, who would later become president, faced the decision. In Texas, the governor cannot independently halt an execution but can only act on recommendations from the Board of Pardons and Paroles. On January 28, 1998, that board rejected Tucker's clemency request. Bush declined to intervene. On February 3, 1998, Karla Faye Tucker was transported to the Huntsville unit for her execution. For her final meal, she requested only a banana, a peach, and a garden salad. She selected 4 witnesses to observe her death, including Ronald Carlson, who'd forgiven her. In her final statement, Tucker apologized to the families of her victims, expressed her love for those present, and said she was about to be face to face with Jesus. As the drugs began to flow through her veins at 6:37 in the evening, she praised Jesus, looked toward the ceiling, and hummed softly. 8 minutes later, at 6:45, she was gone. She was 38 years old and became the first woman executed in Texas since 1863, and only the second woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976. Richard Thornton, Deborah's husband, watched the execution. His words afterward were unforgiving. He declared that he wanted every victim in the world to demand such justice, and that Tucker would now answer to his wife in whatever realm awaited. He dismissed her Christianity as performance, her transformation as staged. His pain was a reminder that while Tucker's redemption may have been real to her and to God, it could never undo what had been done. 2 people had died in terror and agony because of choices she made. No amount of prayer could bring them back. Teresa Lewis. Intelligence is supposed to shield us from manipulation, isn't it? We assume that grown adults, regardless of their intellectual capacity, can distinguish right from wrong, recognize when they're being used, resist the pull of someone else's darkness. But what happens when a woman tests just above the threshold that separates disability from capability? What happens when she falls into the hands of someone who recognizes her weakness and sees not a person but an opportunity? And when that terrible plan unfolds and people die? Who truly deserves the harshest punishment? The one who held the weapon, or the one whose door was left unlocked? Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis had spent 41 years navigating a world that always seemed just slightly beyond her grasp. Born in April of 1969 in rural Virginia, she grew up in chaos that offered neither stability nor protection. By the time she met Julian Clifton Lewis Jr. in 2000 at a textile factory in Danville, she was a woman accustomed to following rather than leading, to saying yes when she should have said no. Julian was a widower, grieving his wife, who had died just 4 months earlier. They married quickly. Julian's younger son, 25-year-old Charles, had joined the Army Reserve and was preparing for deployment to Iraq. Like many soldiers heading overseas, he took out a life insurance policy for $250,000, naming his father as primary beneficiary and Teresa as secondary. In the fall of 2002, Teresa met 2 young men while standing in line at a Walmart. Matthew Jesse Schallenberger was 21. His friend Rodney Lamont Fuller was 19. They exchanged phone numbers, and within days, Teresa had begun a relationship with both. What started as an affair evolved into something darker. Conversations turned to Julian's insurance, to the money that would come if he died. Schallenberger began shaping a plan, convincing Teresa that together they could have everything. All she had to do was leave the door unlocked. On October 23, 2002, Teresa gave Schallenberger and Fuller $1,200 to purchase weapons. Their first attempt to kill Julian while he was driving failed. A week later, on the night of October 30th, they tried again. Teresa prayed with her husband that evening, then waited. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, Schallenberger and Fuller entered through the back door Teresa had left open. While she stood in the kitchen, Schallenberger walked into the bedroom where Julian slept and fired multiple shotgun blasts into his body. Fuller went to Charles's room and shot him repeatedly. Then Teresa did something that sealed her fate. While her husband lay dying on the bedroom floor, she went through his wallet and divided $300 with Schallenberger and Fuller before they fled. She waited approximately 30 minutes before calling 911. When deputies arrived, Julian was still clinging to life. His final words were simple and damning. "My wife knows who done this to me." Teresa initially claimed an unknown intruder dressed in black had broken in, but investigators arrested Schallenberger and Fuller within days, and both confessed, identifying Teresa as the one who arranged everything. Within a week, Teresa confessed as well. Prosecutors discovered she had already been attempting to gather Julian and Charles's assets before they'd even been buried, trying to withdraw $50,000 using a forged check. Teresa's defense attorneys advised her to plead guilty and request sentencing by the judge rather than a jury. Judge Charles Strauss had never imposed a death sentence before. They believed this was her best chance. They were wrong. In June of 2003, Judge Strauss sentenced Teresa to death, calling her the head of this serpent, the mastermind who orchestrated everything. Schallenberger and Fuller, who actually pulled the triggers, both received life sentences. But as Teresa sat at the Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women, new information emerged. Testing revealed Teresa's IQ was 72. A second test produced a score of 70. These numbers placed her in the borderline range of intellectual disability. 3 forensic psychology experts diagnosed her with dependent personality disorder, characterized by an excessive need to be taken care of and inability to make decisions independently. More damaging to the prosecution's theory was evidence about Schallenberger himself. Before his death in prison in 2006, a letter he had written surfaced. In it, he described Teresa as exactly what he had been looking for, someone he could easily use. He wrote that the only reason he had slept with her was to manipulate her into giving him the insurance money, calling her an ugly woman who had married for money and whom he knew would fall for him. Rodney Fuller provided a sworn affidavit stating that Schallenberger had come up with the plan to kill Julian and that everyone knew Teresa wasn't very smart. Fuller said Schallenberger was definitely the one in charge. Schallenberger's IQ was 113, 41 points higher than Teresa's. Author John Grisham became involved, writing that evidence clearly suggested Schallenberger was the actual architect of the murders. Thousands signed petitions asking Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell to commute Teresa's sentence. Appeals came from Amnesty International, religious organizations, and the European Union. But Governor McDonnell denied all clemency requests. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. On September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was transported to the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarratt, Virginia. For her final meal, she requested fried chicken, sweet peas with butter, apple pie, and a Dr. Pepper. At 8:55 that evening, she was led into the death chamber. Witnesses reported she looked anxious as officers placed her on the gurney and secured leather straps around her body. She asked whether Kathy Clifton, the daughter of Julian and sister of Charles, was present in the viewing room. When told she was, Teresa gave her final statement. "I just want Kathy to know that I love you, and I'm very sorry." At 9:13, she was gone. She became the first woman executed in Virginia since 17-year-old Virginia Christian died in the electric chair in 1912, and the first woman executed anywhere in America since 2005. The case sparked intense debate that continues today. Was Teresa truly the mastermind, or was she a woman with limited intellectual capacity who was used and discarded by someone far more cunning? Did the justice system rightfully punish the person most responsible, or did it execute someone who lacked the mental ability to fully understand the consequences while the true architect received mercy? 2 men are gone, shot in their beds by killers welcomed through a door left open by someone they trusted. Whether Teresa Lewis was the serpent or simply another victim is a question that divides us still. Wanda Jean Allen. Violence in intimate relationships follows patterns we think we understand. There's usually an escalation, a series of warning signs, moments where intervention might have changed everything. But what happens when those patterns repeat themselves, not just once, but twice? What happens when someone who has already taken a life, in a moment of rage, is released back into the world, only to find herself in another volatile relationship that ends the exact same way? And when that person has an IQ barely above the threshold of intellectual disability and a history of severe head trauma? Who exactly are we executing? A calculating repeat offender, or someone whose brain simply couldn't process the consequences of her actions? Wanda Jean Allen was born on August 17, 1959, the second of 8 children in a family struggling on public assistance in Oklahoma City. Her childhood was marked by instability and injury. At 12 years old, she was struck by a truck and knocked unconscious. At 14, she was stabbed in the left temple. The cumulative effect of these traumas would become central to debates about her mental capacity years later. An IQ test, administered when she was 15, produced a score of 69, placing her just within the range that experts classify as indicating intellectual impairment. She dropped out of high school without graduating and drifted through her teenage years without direction or support. In 1981, 21-year-old Wanda was sharing an apartment with Deidre Pettis, a childhood friend who had become her girlfriend. On June 29th of that year, they got into an argument. In her confession, she claimed she accidentally shot Pettis from roughly 30 feet away while defending herself. But forensic analysis painted a different picture. A police expert examining the body found bruises and powder burns that suggested Wanda had pistol-whipped Pettis before shooting her at point-blank range. Despite the discrepancies in her story, prosecutors offered Wanda a deal. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a 4-year sentence. She served only 2 years before being paroled in 1982. It was during this incarceration that Wanda met Gloria Jean Leathers, who was serving time for her own manslaughter conviction. When Wanda was released, she offered Gloria a place to stay once her sentence ended. By 1988, the 2 women were living together in the Village, a suburb of Oklahoma City. Their relationship was volatile from the start. Police had been called to their home multiple times for domestic disturbances. On December 1, 1988, Wanda and Gloria got into an argument at a grocery store. A police officer was called to break up the confrontation. He escorted both women back to their home and stood by while Gloria packed her belongings. Before leaving, Wanda asked Gloria to stay and work things out. When Gloria refused and headed to her car, she grabbed a garden rake and struck Wanda in the face with it. Gloria and her mother, Ruby Wilson, then drove to the village police department to file a complaint against Wanda. Wanda followed them. She was carrying a handgun, a direct violation of her probation from the Deidre Pettis case. What happened next took place in broad daylight in the parking lot of a police station. As Gloria and her mother arrived and exited their vehicle, Wanda approached. According to Ruby Wilson, who witnessed everything, Wanda pulled a .22 caliber pistol from her coat pocket and fired a single shot into Gloria's abdomen from just 2 to 3 feet away. Gloria collapsed. She was rushed to the hospital but died 4 days later on December 5th. In her final moments of consciousness, she identified Wanda as the person who shot her. Wanda fled the scene, hid the weapon near her home, and was arrested the following day. The prosecution moved swiftly. Given Wanda's prior manslaughter conviction, they announced they would seek the death penalty. At trial, Wanda's defense attorneys tried to argue self-defense, pointing to Gloria's own criminal history, which included a 1979 stabbing case where Gloria had killed another woman. But the judge ruled this testimony was hearsay and excluded it. The prosecutor portrayed Wanda as someone who had learned nothing from her first killing, a repeat offender who represented a continuing danger. The jury agreed. They convicted her and recommended death. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors brought up the Dedra Pettis case in detail, comparing the two killings. The judge sentenced Wanda to death. It wasn't until after the trial that Wanda's defense attorney discovered the full extent of her cognitive impairments. Multiple experts would later testify that her head injuries as a child had caused organic brain damage that affected her ability to control impulses and understand consequences. Her case became a focal point for debates about executing people with intellectual disabilities. Advocacy groups including Amnesty International took up her cause. The Reverend Jesse Jackson traveled to Oklahoma to protest. Thousands signed petitions asking Governor Frank Keating to commute her sentence. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board reviewed her clemency petition on December 15, 2000, and denied it. Governor Keating refused to intervene. The United States Supreme Court declined to stop the execution. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was transported to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. 24 relatives of both Gloria Leathers and Dedra Pettis traveled there to witness her death. As Wanda was placed on the gurney and leather straps were secured around her body, she appeared anxious. In her final words, Wanda quoted scripture, saying, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Then, in a moment her attorney Steve Presson would later describe as her way of saying goodbye. She stuck her tongue out at him and smiled. At 9:21 that evening, she was gone. Wanda Jean Allen became the first woman executed in Oklahoma since statehood in 1907 and the first black woman executed in the United States since 1954. The relatives of Gloria Leathers told reporters the execution gave them closure. Ruby Wilson, who had watched her daughter get shot and who had later met with Wanda and forgiven her, expressed relief that it was finally over. But, for many who followed the case, Wanda's execution raised questions that have never been answered. Was she truly capable of understanding what she had done? Did her brain injuries and low IQ mean she lacked the capacity for the kind of moral culpability that justifies the ultimate punishment? Or was she simply a violent person who made the same terrible choice twice? 2 women are dead because Wanda Jean Allen pulled a trigger in moments of rage. Whether executing her served justice or simply added another tragedy remains a question that divides us still. Betty Lou Beets. Marriage is supposed to be about love, partnership, building a life together. But what happens when marriage becomes a pattern, a transaction, something you repeat over and over with different faces but the same ending? What happens when the person standing at the altar has buried bodies in her past, literally buried them beneath ornamental gardens and storage sheds? And when that person claims every husband was a monster who beat her, who drove her to desperation, do we believe her? Or do we look at the trail of dead men and see something else entirely? Betty Lou Dunavant was born on March 12, 1937, in Roxborough, North Carolina. Her childhood was defined by poverty and trauma. She claimed her father was violent and had abused her. A bout of measles left her nearly deaf. Her mother was institutionalized when Betty was 12, leaving her to care for her younger siblings. At 15, she married her first husband. It was 1952, and Betty was already pregnant. She would eventually have 6 children with different men, most of whom she would send away to live with relatives as she pursued her next relationship. Betty's marriages followed a disturbing pattern. Her second husband, Billy York Lane, learned just how dangerous that pattern could be. In 1972, Betty shot him in the back of the head. He survived, and Betty was allowed to plead guilty to misdemeanor assault. Her third husband, Ronnie Threlkeld, claimed she tried to run him over with a car. He too survived, but husbands 4 and 5 would not be so fortunate. Doyle Wayne Barker became Betty's fourth husband. Their relationship was volatile, marked by fights and financial troubles. In October of 1981, Doyle disappeared. Betty told neighbors he had simply left her. No one filed a missing person report. Life went on, and Betty moved forward to the next man. Jimmy Don Beets was a Dallas Fire Department captain and a decorated firefighter. When he met Betty Lou, he was lonely and looking for companionship. They married, and Jimmy became husband number 5. He brought with him a pension and life insurance policies, totaling over $100,000. Betty was named as beneficiary. For a woman who had spent her entire life struggling with money, these benefits represented security. They also represented motive. On August 6, 1983, Betty reported Jimmy Don missing from their home near Cedar Creek Lake in Henderson County, Texas. She told authorities he had gone fishing and never returned. 3 weeks later, his boat was found drifting on the lake with his fishing license, heart medication, and life jacket inside. Authorities assumed he had drowned. They dragged the lake for weeks, but never found his body. Betty filed for his pension and insurance benefits. She sold the boat. She moved on. Nearly 2 years passed before the Henderson County Sheriff's Department received a tip. In June of 1985, investigators obtained an arrest warrant. When they searched Betty's property, they made a discovery that shocked even seasoned detectives. Jimmy Don's remains were found buried in the front yard, underneath an ornamental wishing well. He had been shot twice with a .38 caliber pistol. Under a storage shed in the backyard, investigators found the remains of Doyle Wayne Barker. He had been shot 3 times with the same caliber weapon. Betty's own children provided the most damning testimony. Her son, Robert Branson, told investigators that his mother had confided in him before the murder, telling him to leave the house. When he returned 2 hours later, Jimmy Don was dead with 2 gunshot wounds. Robert helped his mother bury the body. The next day, Betty placed some of Jimmy's heart medication in his fishing boat. Then she and Robert removed the propeller and abandoned the boat in Cedar Creek Lake, staging an accidental drowning. Betty's daughter, Shirley Stenger, revealed that she had helped her mother bury Doyle Wayne Barker back in October of 1981. Both children had kept their mother's secrets for years. Betty's trial began on July 11, 1985. She pleaded not guilty, claiming her children had committed the murders and were framing her. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They showed the jury that Betty had attempted to collect over $100,000 in benefits after Jimmy's death. They demonstrated that all 5 bullets recovered from both bodies matched a .38 caliber pistol seized from Betty's residence. They presented testimony from her children about her confessions. Betty's defense attorney made critical mistakes. He failed to present evidence of the abuse Betty claimed she had suffered throughout her life. He never called expert witnesses to testify about trauma or domestic violence. Most troublingly, a conflict of interest emerged. Betty had consulted this same attorney about collecting fire insurance money more than a year after Jimmy's death, meaning the attorney knew she hadn't been aware of the benefits at the time of the murder. But because he was representing her at trial, he couldn't testify to that fact. Instead, he had Betty sign over all media rights to her story to him, positioning himself to profit from her conviction. On October 11, 1985, the jury found Betty guilty. 3 days later, they sentenced her to death. She became one of the few women on death row in Texas. Her appeals continued for 15 years, twice resulting in reversals due to legal deficiencies, only to have the death sentence reinstated each time. As her execution date approached, advocacy groups rallied around Betty. Amnesty International argued that the jury had never heard evidence of the severe abuse she had endured throughout her life. Supporters claimed she had been rendered nearly deaf at age 6, that she had been abused by her father, that every husband except one had beaten her. They argued her actions were the result of trauma and desperation, not greed. Governor George W. Bush received thousands of letters asking him to commute her sentence. He declined. On February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was transported to the Huntsville unit. She was 62 years old. She did not request a final meal. When given the opportunity to make a final statement, she declined. At 6:18 that evening, she died by lethal injection. She became the second woman executed in Texas since the Civil War and only the fourth woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty. The debate about Betty Lou Beets continues. Was she a calculating predator who married men for their money and killed them when they were no longer useful? Or was she a profoundly damaged woman who had been victimized her entire life and finally fought back? The evidence shows a woman who shot one husband in the head, tried to run over another, and buried two more in her yard after shooting them. It also shows a woman who grew up in poverty and chaos, who claimed to have been assaulted as a child, who married at 15 and spent decades in relationships marked by violence. Two men are dead, their bodies hidden beneath the surface of a life that looked normal from the outside. Whether Betty Lou Beets was a victim who became a killer, or simply a killer who claimed victimhood, is a question that divided public opinion then and divides it still. Darlie Routier. Sometimes, the most damning evidence against a person isn't found in blood spatter patterns or forensic reports. Sometimes it's found in a moment caught on camera, a fleeting expression that seems to contradict everything we believe about how a mother should mourn. But is that fair? Is it right to judge someone's guilt or innocence by whether they cry the way we expect them to, whether they grieve according to an unwritten script? These are the questions that have haunted the case of Darlie Routier for nearly 3 decades, dividing public opinion into two warring camps: those who see a woman condemned for failing to perform grief correctly, and those who see something far more sinister hiding beneath the surface. In the early morning hours of June 6, 1996, a frantic 911 call came from the affluent Dallas suburb of Rolette, Texas. 26-year-old Darlie Routier was screaming into the phone that someone had broken into her home and stabbed her children. When police arrived within minutes, they found a scene of unspeakable horror. 6-year-old Devon was already gone, his small body bearing wounds so deep the knife had nearly passed completely through him. 5-year-old Damon was still fighting for his life, but he would die before reaching the hospital. Darlie herself had been wounded, with cuts to her arms and a slash across her throat that doctors later said came within 2 millimeters of severing her carotid artery. A necklace she'd been wearing had pressed into her skin and possibly saved her life by stopping the blade. Her account of that night painted a picture of sudden terror. She told investigators she'd fallen asleep on the downstairs couch while watching television with her boys. She woke to Damon's voice calling out to her, noticed a man in her home, and followed him as he fled toward the garage. The crime scene appeared to support an intruder theory at first glance. A window screen in the garage had been slashed. A wine glass was broken on the floor. Most intriguingly, a sock bearing the blood of both boys was discovered 75 yards away in an alley behind the house. But as investigators dug deeper, the pieces stopped fitting together. The windowsill where the intruder supposedly entered showed an undisturbed layer of dust. The mulch outside remained untouched, with no footprints. The garage showed no blood drops, despite Darlie claiming the attacker had fled that way. And then there were Darlie's wounds, which some medical experts would later describe as appearing carefully inflicted to avoid major damage. What turned public sentiment decisively against Darlie Routier happened 8 days after the murders. The family held what should have been Devon's 7th birthday at the cemetery. A local news crew filmed the gathering at the family's invitation. What they captured became perhaps the most analyzed home video in criminal justice history. There was Darlie, recently released from the hospital, smiling and laughing as she sprayed silly string over her son's graves while the family sang happy birthday. She appeared to be chewing gum. She was animated, even cheerful. For prosecutors and much of the public, this footage revealed a woman unbroken by the loss that should have destroyed her. For the defense, it showed a family trying to honor what Devon would have wanted, following a solemn prayer service that the cameras never broadcast. When Darlie was arrested on June 18, 1996, the police chief announced that they believed the intruder she'd described had never existed. They theorized she had staged the entire scene, inflicting her own wounds and planting the bloody sock before calling for help. The prosecution would build their case around financial stress. The Routier family business was struggling, debts were mounting, and the boys had small life insurance policies. They painted a picture of a woman who'd grown resentful of her children, who saw them as obstacles to the glamorous life she craved. A former friend testified that Darlie had mentioned attempting suicide weeks before the murders. Overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood and money troubles, the trial moved to Kerrville because of intense media coverage in the Dallas area. Comparisons to Susan Smith, who drowned her children just years earlier, followed Darlie everywhere. The prosecution's case rested heavily on blood evidence. They pointed to a small amount of Devon and Damon's blood found on the back of Darlie's nightshirt, arguing it was cast-off spatter that could only have gotten there as she raised the knife repeatedly to stab them. They emphasized the impossibility of her timeline. The medical examiner testified that Damon could have survived his wounds for approximately 8 minutes. Darlie had been on the phone with 911 for nearly 6 of those minutes. The prosecution argued there simply wasn't enough time for her to have inflicted her own injuries, staged an elaborate crime scene, run 75 yards to plant the sock, and returned before help arrived. The defense countered that this very impossibility proved her innocence. The silly string video was played again and again during deliberations. One juror later revealed in an affidavit that they watched it 8 or 9 times. After just 8 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. On February 1st, 1997, Darlie Routier was found guilty of murdering Damon. 3 days later, she received a death sentence. She has never been tried for Devon's murder, though those charges remain pending. But the story didn't end there. What emerged in the years following her conviction has cast long shadows of doubt over the proceedings. The court reporter who transcribed the trial made over 30,000 errors in the official record, mistakes so numerous they became grounds for appeal. A bloody fingerprint found on a coffee table in the Routier home matched no one in the family and has never been identified. The sock found in the alley, which the prosecution claimed Darlie planted, contained blood and DNA, but none of Darlie's blood, raising questions about how she could have transported it without leaving a trace. Multiple jurors have since stated that had they seen the complete video from the cemetery, showing the prayer service that preceded the birthday celebration, they might have reached a different conclusion. DNA testing has been ordered and reordered as technology has advanced. Courts granted new testing in 2008, then again in 2014. As of today, those results remain pending, delayed by bureaucratic processes and legal wrangling. Darlie's former husband Darren, who divorced her in 2011, maintains her innocence. He's revealed information that wasn't presented at trial, including his own conversations about staging a burglary for insurance purposes in the weeks before the murders, a revelation that could have pointed investigators in entirely different directions. Darlie Routier now sits in the Patrick O'Daniel unit in Gatesville, Texas, one of 6 women on death row in the state. She's been there for over 27 years, maintaining her innocence at every parole hearing, in every interview, in every legal filing. Her surviving son Drake, who was 7 months old and sleeping upstairs on the night his brothers died, has grown into adulthood without his mother. The case has become a focal point for those who question how reliably we can judge guilt based on emotional displays. how easily confirmation bias can shape an investigation, and whether our justice system sometimes confuses unusual behavior with criminality. Whether Darlie Routier is a woman who committed an unthinkable act, or a grieving mother who became a victim of a rush to judgment, remains one of the most divisive questions in modern criminal justice. What's certain is that 2 little boys are gone, their lives stolen in the darkness of a June morning, and the full truth of what happened may never be known.